Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the conversation on inclusive assets. Before we start, I just want to sort of quick layout of the hour ahead of us. The idea is that we have a few case study examples to talk through, and then a little bit of an open discussion. So hopefully, we'd be keen to have your thoughts and inputs as well of your experiences towards the end of this session. So please feel free to chip in. So before we go any further, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Simon Kane. I work for United Utilities as the Asset Lifecycle Manager, but I also I'm the chair of the Institute of Asset Management's Northwest Branch. So I'm kind of trying to kill two birds with one stone here. As the Northwest Branch, I'm keen to bring in people from across the asset management arena to talk about their experiences. But within United Utilities, I'm part of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion group, and I'm keen to sort of expand our thinking and our consideration of inclusivity in how we work. And really, I wanted to sort of touch upon the idea of inclusive assets, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Really pleased to say that we're joined today by Joe, who works for Mott MacDonald, and he's got lots of experience in various sectors outside of the water industry, in rail and energy and consultancy more recently. Joe will be able to share some of his views as we go through the meeting, and Ash as well. Ash has got a wealth of experience from all sorts of different sectors across infrastructure. And Ash will be able to provide some of his views on what he sees as well. So the idea is that we'll act as a little bit of a panel to start with. We'll talk through some ideas. We'll share some thoughts. We'll look at some case study examples, and then hopefully we can expand the conversation to all of you who have joined the call, and we'd like to hear from you as well. Okay, so welcome everybody. We've got people from within United Utilities. We've got people from outside of United Utilities as well. I'd be quite interested to see what kind of industries you're all from. So if you wouldn't mind having a go at putting in the chat the industry sector that you work in, it'll give everybody on the call a bit of a quick view of where you come from and what you do. So if you're from water sector, put water, etc. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that'd be great. And we'll see who we've got. I'm going to stop sharing while I do that.
Gosh, there's an awful lot of people from water.
Lots of water, good. Property, nuclear, great. Manufacturing, great. So a good spread, but a lot of water. That's really interesting to see. We advertise this on the IAM's website, so hopefully that's why we've got people from different sectors in here, but you're all welcome. Thanks for joining. Right, so screen again. So we'll do a quick intro to the topic. I'll do that. We'll talk through some examples from United Utilities, and we'll talk about some of the characteristics, the broader characteristics we might want to consider in here, and how it fits with the life cycle, and Joe will talk us through those pieces. Ash will then go on to talk through some of the global case studies that he's seen through his work. Then we'll focus a little bit of attention on existing legislation and guidance, and hopefully that will be enough information to prompt a rich conversation with all of your input, any experiences you've got, and we'll take it from there. So without further ado, as I said before, I'm United Utilities rep for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, something that's really close to my heart. I'm a member of the Gender Equality Network as well, something that I think is doing really well at UU, particularly from a people and organisational perspective. We've recently launched our ED&I report, the first one of this scale, in 2023, and I think it's a really good read. It's accessible from our external website. It's got a photograph of a few handsome people on the front there as well. You'll notice. It talks about gender, ethnicity, social mobility, disability, and sexual orientation, some of the protected characteristics that we face when employing such a large number of people. And UU employs somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 people at the moment. It's a large employer, and so ED&I is something that's really important to us in the Northwest. We've also got strong links into multicultural apprenticeships, disability confident awards, inclusive employers awards, and things like that. And I know we've been really good at starting to tackle that historic bias that's been sort of created through the types of people that we employ and the people that we potentially exclude from employing, and that's something that we're looking to drive, and I think we're doing a really good job. What I'm really interested in is being an asset management professional. How do we think about that from a point of view of our asset base? Are they inclusive enough? Do we think about the assets that we own, operate, and maintain, and what impact that has on the inclusivity that we have, not just for our workforce, but for the people that use those assets that might not be United Utilities staff? They might be public, there might be other stakeholders, there might be suppliers, things like that. And do we think about who's going to use those assets now and in the future? And actually, are we excluding some of those people unconsciously or otherwise? And finally, is that okay? So that's really the premise of the conversation for today. Are our assets inclusive enough? And it's not just a snapshot of UU. I think United Utilities can do better, but I'm really interested to see what other organisations in other industries think, and whether as an infrastructure sector we consider it enough. So it's great to have people from across the country and beyond on this call today. I'm going to start off with a quick example from UU. We have a number of reservoirs across the northwest. One of them is called Dovestones Reservoir up in North Manchester. We've recently spent quite a lot of money on this to make it more accessible to the general public, and that includes accessibility pathways. So if you're a pushchair user or a wheelchair user, you need some kind of wheels, then you can use these paths, and they're much more accessible than a dirt track that runs around the outside of the reservoir. It means you can get access to nature, you can get fresh air, you can see some of our beautiful landscapes, and some of which we maintain and own ourselves, something that we're rightly proud of in United Utilities. And there's really good reasons to be able to provide that kind of access to people in a more wider sense. Something that I think is great, and we do it a number of our reservoirs as well. So Macclesfield Forest, we've got some similar kind of amenity value there. So thinking about how we make our public assets accessible is something that we've been doing for some time. We've got a number of examples of there, but this is quite a neat one to sort of illustrate the type of thing we're thinking about. In our operational sense, I was at one of our biggest treatment works 2 weeks ago, Davyhulme Wastewater Treatment Works. It's just outside of Manchester, and anybody that's been on the motorway past the Trafford Centre and look left as you're going over that big bridge, you'll see the big balls of the big gas bags that we have there. That's Davyhulme. That was at one point the biggest wastewater treatment works in Europe. It's not anymore, but it is still very big. And as I was there 2 weeks ago, I saw this. I was really impressed to see that we've got that accessibility built in to our operational asset site, which is something that a bit of a rarity, I think, but just by happen chance I saw it and I thought I'd take a photograph. Clearly, it's been designed into the site because you can see the steps here have got a nice space for that wheelchair access ramp next to it. Clearly, the parking space is right next to it, so it's been thought through and it's been part of the design of the asset. Unusual because this is one of our operational sites. Whilst we'd expect to see this type of amenity in our head office in Lingley Mere and some of our sort of regional depots, an operational site, I think this is probably a rarity, but a good example of where we do use it. So more broadly, I'm going to sort of talk about what kind of assets we think we've got. So I've spoken to various people across UU in preparation for this, and we've got a number of assets that I think are quite inclusive, and I've listed these here. So on the left-hand side, I think our head office has got really good accessibility. Obviously, that's a huge administration building, access to about 3,000 people. So it's absolutely right that we make sure that that's accessible to all sorts of users, whether they've got mobility issues, whether they've got impairments with sight or hearing, things like that. Unisex toilets, these are things that we've seen in quite a lot of our sites. Some of the bigger sites are better. Some of our operational sites are better at having these types of things than some of our smaller ones, and it comes down to a question of economics, I suppose. Is it worth spending money on a small site where there's only one person there to create this type of accessibility, and that's a conversation we'll get into. Showers, likewise, our emergency showers on site. So where there's a chemical spill or some kind of chemical issue, the showers are unisex. They're accessible. They're usually quite low level, so there's a low ramp, no step access, things like that. Lifts. You've seen an example there from Davyhulme, and within our head office buildings, lifts are really good. We've got faith and prayer rooms in our head office too. That's really good. It makes people feel welcome regardless of their religion. And then PPE, I've put some next to that. So in some cases, our personal protective equipment is inclusive, and by that I mean it's sort of sized right so that anybody can wear it, whether you're male, female, large, small. We do have some PPE that's quite good, but as you'll see on the other side of this, there's still quite a bit where we don't have PPE that's effective for females, for example. So the not inclusive assets that I've seen and we've talked about here in UU, we have reservoir valve towers. So go back to the picture we showed at the beginning, accessing the valve tower on Vernwy, and that tower goes deep under the reservoir. It's a series of ladders that's not massively accessible if you've got mobility issues, or if you're bigger than average, or you're scared of heights, things like that. But then again, that's the type of asset it is. So would you necessarily install a lift? Probably not. Our CityFlex vans, these are the vans that you see driving around that have all the equipment for the network team, for flushing out pipes, for removing obstructions and blockages, and for doing sort of quick fixes, remedial action. And they've got a huge amount of different kit that's accessible that people can use, but it's quite a manual, labour intensive kind of job. So they're not quite as inclusive as maybe some of our other assets. Wet wells, these are the holes in the ground that give us access to our assets that are buried, our pipes, our pumps, things like that. Sometimes these are relatively small holes. They don't necessarily have good access all the time, good strong ladder footings, things like that. Sometimes they're small. And likewise with sewer access hatches. We've all seen the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and they can jump in and out of these things pretty quick, but they're not necessarily as accessible as they could be. And then that kind of leads on to the conversation of, well, some of these assets are more public facing. They're bound to have more people wanting to use them, and some of them are more private and going to be used in more limited circumstances. Therefore, we've got to think about what's reasonable, and we'll come back onto that theme later date. But I just wanted to sort of use that to kind of set the scene of what we're thinking about in terms of inclusive assets, and ask that question again. Do we think about it enough? So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Joe, who will talk about some of the different characteristics of inclusivity.
Brilliant, thank you. So I guess the first thing, I'm really pleased to be here. So thanks for inviting me and for having me. And it's really great to see so many people in the call as well. So it's so I'm quite passionate about the subject. It's really great to see so many people that are interested, wanting to learn more. Just to really quickly introduce myself. So I'm a technical director at Mott MacDonald. So I spend most of my day job thinking about asset management and things like whole life cost, similar to Simon. I should also say, so I'm the comms director for the UK chapter of the Institute of Asset Management, which is a voluntary position. I'm a co-founder and director for the Centre for Asset Studies, which is a think tank active in the UK. And then also, so I was previously a diversity and inclusion party officer in a political party, which led me to doing lots of D&I training and stuff like that. So really, really passionate about this. And I think that one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about is just increasing understanding of diversity, inclusion, and equality, and what we mean by that, and especially in asset management and the built environment. So I guess my definition, so diversity is just understanding the makeup, who are the people that might be in an organization or in a group. Inclusion is just how included do people feel. And then equality being, do people have fair opportunity? So does everyone in that group have fair opportunity? So it could be really, it could be quite interesting, I think, for us to just think about then what characteristics we might consider. And again, if we focus in on asset management and the built environment, and a lot of that then is designing our assets and designing that built environment, that could be quite cool. So this next bit now, the exercise, is going to be interactive. I think we'll use the chat function. That's probably the best thing to do. But the idea is to just, if we could share some thoughts about different characteristics that we might need to consider when we're designing for inclusivity. Yeah. It'd be great to hear what people think, basically. I don't know, chuck in some thoughts in the chat, that'd be great. I might, just to get the ball rolling perhaps, maybe I could give a practical example. So Simon earlier shared the example of wheelchair access, so accessibility and wheelchair users. So that could be one characteristic, is do people like how accessible from for wheelchair users. But does anyone have any other thoughts about what other things we might want to consider? Yeah, go on, Tara.
I put one in the chat, which is really the documentation about assets. Certainly in the past, if not now, War and Peace gets written. How much of it gets read, and in particular, how accessible is that for people who may be visually impaired, maybe dyslexic, etc. So just thinking about that side of assets, because that could significantly impact how they're maintained.
Yeah, that's a really, really good one. And I guess we might think about neurodiversity. So sometimes we think about things in terms of like disabilities, but actually what's quite interesting is that we're all different, and we all have different approaches to reading and to accessing information. Quite often, historically, we focus as you suggest, we focus on manuals that are written with lots of words, whereas sometimes just something visual might be actually way more inclusive, way more accessible to a lot more a broader range of the workforce and different people and whoever is interacting with it. Yeah, use of video. I've seen someone's put color. That's another really good one. So yeah, when we're doing diagrams, how often do we consider actually, you know, if say for example, if you've got a graph or a chart or something to display information, if you're using, I'm trying to remember the colors now, that can sometimes be confused. But I think it's like certain shades of green and certain shades of red. For certain people, they might not be able to see the difference. So that's not always great. Yep, signage is often a good one. So yeah, so that's a really good comment as well, Paul. Thanks for that. Yeah, and I think there is definitely something around normalizing, just thinking about who are the users and people that will interact with the asset at any point. So in a moment, we've got a second exercise that might be interesting, perhaps for that. Yeah, fantastic. Yes, that's another good one. So yeah, provision for toilets and stuff for genders, but also just more generally. So something that came up when Simon and I were talking about this this session. So something that is very often overlooked, and I think actually it came up as well in the last year in the Institute for Asset Management in the UK conference. So quite often we build our spaces for an average 6-foot man, typically a man that is 6 foot tall and is has no disabilities or any kind of anything, you know, any like diversity basically, anything. Whereas in reality, some people are shorter, some people are taller. So like if you need access to a plant room, is it possible for a very tall person to easily get in or a shorter person? And often like male and female characteristics, or quite often men and women are different sizes, different typical strength. But then to be fair, like that can be vary across all people. I guess the point is just it's only when you start actively or proactively considering those characteristics that it can be useful when you're thinking about the design. So if you're building plant, like some kind of machinery or plant in a room, is it possible to actually navigate around that plant to maintain it properly from all angles? And it might be possible for your typical design standard, so your 6-foot man to better get around, like navigate their way around that plant, but actually, is it possible, easy for anyone to get there? And I guess just at that point, just to share as well some of the context to this. So we do have, I know it affects the water industry, but it affects most engineering and asset management or asset intensive businesses, infrastructure companies. We have an aging workforce. So the characteristics, another characteristic there about age, we know that as people get older, their ability to access stuff diminishes. It's like really, you know, normal. It also means that the availability of staff to do the work, the demographics in the UK are changing, and therefore the availability of staff is also changing. So there's also a kind of like a need to make sure that we're building environments that are suitable for the workforce of the future. So, for example, I guess what I'm saying is it might have been that 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you could get away with building things in a certain way because there were plenty of, you know, 20-year-old men that could go and maintain it. Whereas now, actually, we might need to start thinking about how do you maintain it if you have an aging workforce and the number of available workers are reduced. So is it possible for us to make it more possible for a greater breadth of society to be able to do this work? Just checking the chat again. Yeah, brilliant. So I wonder, is it worth going back to the slide? I think in the slides we did put in some characteristics, and then the slide notes we've got loads. I think so. Hopefully that was interesting. Hopefully it got us all thinking about different characteristics we might want to consider. Some characteristics could be, yeah, so mobility, height, size, how strong someone is, gender can be quite important, language. Yeah, also like how are we, so training and complexity. So are we making things so that they're going to be intuitive and easy to maintain, or to replace, to install, to take away, to operate, all that sort of stuff. And then there's lots of other things as well. So like, yeah, we might have seen, and so previously, other times where I've done this exercise, people have talked about male and female gender, kind of, yeah, non-binary, intersex, age, so younger people, older people, retired people, students. Yeah, there's many different things or characteristics we might consider. Another one that sometimes comes up, doesn't always come up, but is things like, is English first language? So in an increasingly international world, are we designing for, again, intuitive design, but also like, I think Sarah mentioned earlier, with our design manuals and our operating manuals, are they always in English, and are they in simple English that's easy to understand, stuff like that. Right at the beginning of my career, I mentioned in the chat earlier, I started in water, and one of the designs I worked on was a drainage system for a refuse transfer station. And what I found really interesting was half the signage was in Polish. So they had, basically the community of people that worked in that site of Polish workers was so high, they'd ended up having dual language signage in the entire site. And that was something that we had to basically do. But obviously someone had thought about the people operating that location and had made reasonable adjustments to make it safe and efficient in that environment. Okay, I'm mindful of the time. We will get opportunity at the end to talk openly as well, but maybe if we go to the next activity. So thinking about those characteristics, again, answering in the chat would be fantastic, but actually I shouldn't assume that everyone's familiar with the idea of the asset lifecycle. So asset lifecycle, we sometimes think about the asset from the perspective of cradle to grave, or we sometimes talk about like the whole life of an asset. Basically what we mean is, well, in a very simplified way, you might start with a greenfield site, there's nothing there, and then you have the idea for an asset, and you might then design the asset, you might then start to do work on site, do site preparation, you might then build it, and then it is constructed. For the life of, during the operational life of the asset, you might operate it, you might need to do some maintenance to it, you might renew it at some point, or replace it, or enhance it, and eventually you might choose to decommission it and return it back to however the environment was before you started. So in this exercise, what we're quite good to do is to think about some of the different characteristics we were talking about earlier, and it'd be quite great if anyone had any thoughts about where we should be thinking about those different characteristics, and where should we be thinking about inclusivity. So I don't know, interesting questions. Like, is it better to think about it right at the beginning in design, or do we think about it in the building and construction phases? Like maybe both of those things. And then if we think about the different groups, are we talking about the inclusivity as it relates to the end user? Should we be thinking about that in the design phase? Operators, maintainers, contractors that might be building it and doing it, or the general public? Yeah, it'd be awesome to have some chat about that. And I don't know if Simon and Ashley, and feel free to jump in. I can see you're itching to comment.
So in industries like ours, we have got a lot of assets that already exist. So in many instances, the time to think about it during design has passed. So sometimes it has to be retrospective by its nature, but in a perfect world, we might want to think about it earlier in the process as a line of thought. Ash, sorry, I jumped in at the same time as you then. Go on.
Yeah, no, we were both sort of like thinking about it. I mean, I think there's been some really thoughtful and interesting questions or comments in the chat, which actually I probably won't touch on now. But I think actually in reality, yes, there's sort of the phases of the design elements, and actually acknowledging that probably for us in the UK, most of our work potentially is in that sort of brownfields kind of modifying existing designs rather than building new. So I think it's quite complex, and you know, actually, like all inclusivity itself, it's not quite as simple as it first appears. Probably stop at that.
Yeah. I think there's a general theme emerging, which I tend to agree with, which is that there's a huge opportunity during the design phase to have a really big impact on the inclusivity of the asset. What I do find quite interesting, you know, we were looking at the chart, the little graphic earlier. During the design, though, we probably don't need to worry about how inclusive. Well, maybe we do. I don't know. It's interesting, isn't it? But for the general public, for example, the amount of how you think about the general public and how you include the general public is different at the different stages. So, for example, in site preparation and your building construction phases, a lot of your thinking might be around prevention of access from the general public to a work site. But also what can be quite cool is, I don't know if you've seen, on a lot of sites now, they put little windows in the got the technical name for it now, but the walls you basically put around the work site. They put windows at different heights so that different people can look in and see what's going on, and feel, again, it's about, if you're building something, the likelihood is the general public, yeah, part of it is keeping them safe and therefore keeping them out of the site. But if it's near where someone lives, how are you considering including them in that? Again, the design is quite important. So how are they consulted or engaged with during the design of that works? But also while the works are happening, one way of approaching that project is you completely exclude the local residents and the people, the general public around it, and you make like a, you know, as far as possible, this like sanitary kind of site where you can work in perfect conditions. The other is you actually bring in your local residents and you show them what's happening and you explain why there's noises and like what's actually happening. And again, that can lead to more positive outcomes. So the inclusivity aspect, so going back to those definitions, how included do people feel? Actually, it can be really useful to think about all aspects of inclusivity across, so the full life of the asset, and also the different types of people with their different characteristics. Okay, brilliant. I think, look, that was I think that was quite a positive exercise. Quite interesting. Lots of chat, which is really brilliant. So thank you everyone for getting involved, engaging.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joe. So I'll move on to the next slide then. In that case, and Ashley, I'll let you introduce yourself, and you can talk about some of the inclusive infrastructure you've seen.
Well, thank you. First of all, just say, in my concept of inclusivity, I'm actually in a public space, so there's probably quite a lot of background noise. So my apologies for that. I think, actually, I was thinking about it as you were talking earlier. You know, acknowledging the fact that there's 8 billion people on the earth. Actually, in reality, we've all got unique and personal needs. And in fact, actually, the conversation to date has sort of like been trying to sort of segment or put things into categories. I would actually maintain that actually to actually even think about the concept of inclusive infrastructure, you've got to acknowledge that actually everybody is unique. And although actually we try to categorize, actually in reality, as soon as we categorize, we're actually denying the uniqueness of each of us as individuals. So I mean, I think, you know, it's a very interesting topic, this. And my attempt or my thinking is that we should come from that, well, actually, we're all unique. So what does that mean for us? So and the concept of lived experience, which is another way of perhaps looking at inclusive infrastructure. Lived experience is only what each of us think about the way that we experience the world, and so that is unique and complex. So I think a complex issue. The first side there really was just to say, look, we've got lots of infrastructure. I was going to say, but it's already been said before, that we've got infrastructure of various different ages and various different complexities and various different types. And so can you apply a one size fits all? I maintain not. And so perhaps that's one of the things I'd like to sort of just put into the debate is that can we actually segment and can we put basic parameters around it? I think to the point that Joe was making, I mean, perhaps the best time to design in inclusivity in infrastructure is during design, but acknowledging the fact that actually most of what's actually being built in the built environment in developed countries has probably already been built. How do we retrofit, and do we retrofit? And if we do, how do we make a decision about which bits we retrofit and which bits we don't? So I thought your table, Si, was quite interesting about internal versus external, or public versus non-public, and I think that's an interesting way to look at it. So if we just go on to the next slide. Thank you. I suppose I really want to apologise firstly here for people who are not in electricity or water, and I had assumed that a large number would be UU and therefore would fit into those two categorizations. I think what I wanted to try to do here was to say, well, actually, in reality, and we don't need to go into the detail in this presentation, but it was really just to see, well, what are different utilities thinking about, and where those utilities are in the same area in terms of the same this utility type, are they thinking about the same kinds of things or not? And actually, I think when you look at that, you can see that there are there's the design phase, there's the operational phase, and then actually there are things that actually we haven't touched on to date, which I thought perhaps we could talk about, which is that sense of financial inclusivity, and is it possible to actually accommodate for the fact that not everybody can afford what the average person can afford. So should we be trying to accommodate, and should we be trying to think about different ways of experiencing assets? So I think if we go to the next slide, which hopefully has got some more detail of that, and perhaps we could sort of just use that to step in into the conversation afterwards with the question. So in the top left there, you've got in a sense smart metering, which is trying to provide better data, which is trying to provide better data for whom? Well, I mean, is that users, or is it the utility, or is it third parties? It might be all of those. So actually, how inclusive is inclusive in terms of smart metering question? Going across the top, then we've got a simple utility situation where, if you can see that they've extended the sidewalk or the pavement there to actually go around a utility pole, which is actually sitting in the pedestrian infrastructure. I think that's a really clever example of how inclusive infrastructure doesn't need to be complex, and I'm sure that was retrofitted when that pole was positioned in that case. Coming down on that left-hand side, then you've got this is one of the US utilities. Basically, their mantra is around either get current with payment, or get assistance, or get onto a payment plan, and so they're really looking at that sense of inclusivity from a sense of availability or position to pay. Down at the bottom there, you've got a packaged unit, which is actually trialing new kinds of technology. And you might say, well, actually, inclusivity might be, well, actually, that certain technology is positioned into the environment to suit certain types of people that perhaps may have certain types of needs in a particular geographic location. In the centre, you've got more details about the smart metering, fuel poverty part of that, which I think perhaps labouring, but I think it is important for us to think about that in our inclusive infrastructures dialogue. And then if you go to the top right, there you've got that sense of, well, actually, if you're designing, perhaps are there other ways of doing what we've been doing for the last 10, 50, 100 plus years? And actually, if you're replacing, do you necessarily need to replace like for like, or is it better to actually rethink the whole model? And so rainwater harvesting, certainly where I lived for many years in Auckland in New Zealand, there were parts of the city network which were not reticulated for water and wastewater. And that was deemed to be completely acceptable within a first world major conurbation. And you've got other types of alternative ways of addressing the infrastructure there. In the middle there on the left, you've got about inclusive design. We've talked a little bit about the kinds of things that people might want to think about. And then I think down at the bottom, it's perhaps a little bit fuzzy and not so clear, but that's one of the utilities is actually using the concept of design competitions and trying to reach out to stakeholders beyond themselves as a way to try to actually have inclusivity in their supply chain. And so, I don't know, frankly, whether that would be considered under the classical view of inclusive infrastructure, whether that would be part of it. I think, in my opinion, it probably is. But I'm super keen to hear what people think. So look, thank you for giving me a short slot to ask more questions than I've probably answered, but I hope that actually that's been helpful. Thanks so much.
That's great, Ash. Thank you. And before we move on to questions, I'm just going to sort of tail this off with a little bit of legislation and guidance. So one of the questions in the chat earlier on was about policy and legislation. And through the work I've been doing here at UU, I've asked the question of our engineering teams, what guidance do we have? And typically the guidance is around safety and designing for safety in particular, and that's sort of predicated by the Workplace Health, Safety and Welfare Regulations from 1992 and the approved code of practice that goes along with describing how that should be implemented. And also the construction for design and management regs in 2015, that are both typically safety focused more than inclusivity focused, but there is an element of inclusion as a sort of a side effect of that, I suppose. More sort of specifically, if you look at one of the ISO standards, the safety of machinery, there's a standard there on the permanent means of access to machinery, and again it's coming at it from a safety perspective rather than an inclusion perspective, but it does mean that they're taking into account sort of the typical size of the typical user in terms of deciding how far the corridors need to be, the sort of height of the valves that need to be positioned, walkways, ladders, size, things like that. But again, that kind of raises the question that was touched upon before by Joe, which is typically these sort of data points are biased in the way that they're constructed in the first place. Typically, surveys don't survey all types of people, and they don't really capture the uniqueness that Ash was referencing before. And if anybody's read the book Invisible Women, that sort of really does highlight the sort of the bias inherent in a lot of the data that gets used for designing all sorts of things, from your mobile phone through to the size of a bus seat. Typically they are they are biased by sort of male characteristics, and therefore a lot of assets that get created, a lot of standards that get formed are typically biased towards the male and not towards the female. So, there's inherent bias in a lot of the things that we do, and I think it's something for us to be aware of. And when we think about this, the other element to this was the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and Joe earlier mentioned the term reasonable workplace adjustments, and that's a critical term within Disability Discrimination Act. When you are the owner operator of a business that employs people, and you want to be making sure you're not discriminating against the people who could work for you, then you have to be able to demonstrate these reasonable workplace adjustments so that your staff can work in an effective way. The debate is around the word reasonable, and it depends on the size of the business, the type of work that you're doing, a whole host of different factors. But that's the only kind of inclusion legislation that I could find. Fair enough, it wasn't the most exhaustive piece of work, but I did spend some time looking at this. So I suppose my takeaway from this is there's not a lot of guidance when it comes to thinking about inclusive assets. Safety is well covered, but the wider scope of inclusion is quite limited in its scope. So that was my experience of it. And within United Utilities, we try and distill all that down into our particular standards, and our access lifting and maintenance and fire safety one is probably the one that governs most of our inclusive type standard, particularly in terms of getting around space, making sure our operational sites are navigable, things like that. So just wanted to make sure we've got enough time for a few questions. So I'm gonna park that there and stop sharing, and we'll go back to you as a group. And Ash, Joe, if there's any of the questions in the panel there that you'd like to pick out particularly, or if any of the people on the call would like to raise a hand and just repeat what they've said and use that as a prompt, that'd be great.
Yeah, just while people are thinking about their questions, just on that last point you made about so reasonable adjustment, and I think a lot of historically we've thought about this stuff in quite a defensive perspective. So it's like, how do we keep people safe, or what's a reasonable adjustment to make? Whereas I do feel that there is a very exciting opportunity here, which is to proactively address something to make things better and to address the changing demographics that we're seeing. So rather than reacting, it's actually being proactive and thinking about the future. But I can see Paul's put his hand up, so I'll be quiet now.
Paul.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed this talk. I'm an EDI champion within the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, and when I spoke to Simon, I was shocked that I hadn't even thought about this from an asset management point of view within my own organisation, and I actually felt really bad and guilty, which is incredible, isn't it? That you're working to be better, but then you haven't actually thought about it in the job that you do on a day-to-day basis. It's incredible, isn't it? So what I've done is I've got a question, but I reflected and I thought, well, what level of maturity has the NDA, Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, got? And I sort of made up a simple level. 1, we never do it. 2, we sometimes do it. 3, we always do it. And I think we're sort of around the 2. Sometimes we do it, but maybe it's by accident. But my question is to you experts, I want to change that. So what can I do? How do I improve that maturity within the NDA to help improve so that we always think about inclusivity? I think the answer's in the people and the culture, etc. And there's no magic wands, but I thought I'd ask a tricky question because I genuinely want to solve it as well. Yeah, so, thank you.
Shall we all have a go at it? Paul, I put in the chat about the concept of cultural intelligence, and so like EQ and IQ, I think we could all, as asset management professionals learn a little bit more about cultural intelligence, because in a sense what that would do is it would give us a lens of people other than ourselves, so that actually we could even think about the needs of others when we're actually trying to do either design or operations or decommissioning. And so that would be my simple take out to you, would be, let's try to think about, well, how can we set a frame so that we can think about things in a different way. I mean, I strongly agree with you that this isn't about a mechanism or a process or a list of checks. It's actually about the way that we think about the way we do, and it's people that actually are going to do this. So that's my answer to the question.
Yeah, so just to, I guess if I offer my answer, I was actually quite excited when you said you thought about a maturity assessment. And I guess the reason, so first off, just to say, Paul, like, fantastic, like, thank you for taking on that role. Really, really cool. And really good of you to do it. It's a really important subject I'm passionate about. And I completely agree that there is actually a lack of material guidance in asset management around what we mean by inclusive assets. And so what was quite exciting by you talking about the maturity assessment was actually, it would be really cool if you could support actually the Institute for Asset Management in the development of the literature around this, because I think it is an area where we need more. We as a community, like all of us, need more support. Yeah, I do. I kind of agree with Ashley's point that it's a cultural aspect, and it's around influencing some of the what's the word? Things like, what are the policies and the objectives that your organization are setting, and do we call out explicitly things around inclusivity, and are our leaders in infrastructure businesses, are they thinking about this stuff, and are they empowering their workforce to make positive decisions? That said, I am always a fan of a checklist, and one of the things that what I did when I was a diversity officer was we did introduce some checklists to basically say, are we just, it's not an exclusive or exhaustive list, but it's just, have we considered these things? So we're about to make a decision on something, and then part of what I left behind as well, which is quite cool, but it was just this process of saying, right, before we make that decision, can we just quickly check, can we think of anyone outside of that isn't represented in this room that might be affected by what we've done? How would this affect? So, quite often it was very male dominated in that room. So we'd say, like, have we actually thought about like how women might be affected by this? And we also sort of said, if we hadn't properly considered it, we might have to go find out and get information to support the decisions we're about to make. So I completely agree with the sentiment that we shouldn't just be prescriptive in checklists of, like, that isn't going to be helpful. But I think sometimes it can be helpful to have that deliberate check kind of embedded in your process. So especially before a decision where you say, I'm just going to pause and just, have I actually thought about the inclusive aspect to this? Right? Yeah. Sorry, Sarah, you've been very patiently waiting with your hand up, so I'll yeah.
I think your idea of checklists is a good one. When there's a very unconscious thought process going on, you need to force it into the consciousness. And I think one kind of aspect I was really thinking about is, so much of our perception of safety is based on historic incidents, and if your workforce has not been very diverse in the past, that could seriously mislead you. So just things like that we need to be conscious of going forwards. But I think checklists kind of helps you to do that quick sense check and go, actually, what's the data set almost that this safety rate is based on? And if the workforce is shifting and changing, then you just need to have a dose of skepticism about some of that data.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Good. Well, thank you for those questions. Thank you for those points. That were really interesting. I think has anybody else got any questions before I sort of bring it to a close? Well, So if anybody does, please shout up. But I'd just like to take a minute just to say thank you. Thank you to you all for taking the time out of busy days to come and listen to this discussion. The purpose of it was not to provide all the answers, because nobody has all the answers, but just to prompt the discussion, prompt the thought. Like Paul, when I first heard of this sort of concept, I was surprised I hadn't thought of it beforehand. I'm really passionate about asset management. I'm really passionate about ED&I, but I'd not conflated the two ever before. So I thought, if I've not done that and Paul's not done that, then it's fair to say probably a lot of people, other people haven't as well. So if the only thing that you've got from today is to think about it from a new perspective, then I think that's job done really for this particular webinar. I'd also like you to take a look around the room here and think about reaching out to people you've seen or heard from, or people have commented in the chat. This is the purpose of this, is try and generate a network, so you can pick up the phone and ask questions of where you're dealing with problems that others might have already been dealing with. One of the key drives for the Northwest branch is to try and create this community of practitioners, so that we can share challenges, share ideas, and sort of try and come up with solutions that fit us more widely. Thank you all for the comments. There's some really interesting thoughts in here, thoughts that I haven't come across through the conversations I've had in preparing for this. And I'm sure we're only sort of scraping the iceberg, tip of the iceberg really with this. But I think this is probably the type of thing that starts the cultural change. Just the very fact of thinking about it and talking about it and exploring the different perspectives. We're probably a long way off sort of getting to a maturity level 3, as Paul was describing there, but it's a good start, isn't it, to be thinking about it from the outset. And the last thing I wanted to do is just to thank Joe for his time today, and also in the time leading up preparing for this meeting, and for Ashley as well. Thank you both for engaging with me and for agreeing to spare some of your experience and time in putting on what I think has been a really interesting conversation. So with that said, I'll let you all have a couple of minutes back, but thank you all.
Just to jump in, just to say thank you, Simon, as well. Thanks for organising it and taking the initiative to pull it together. So thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thank you. We'll have a good rest of the day, everybody. And I've recorded this, so we'll get onto the IAM website if you wanted to see it again, or if you're from United Utilities, you can watch it internally. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.